was just 9 years old. My parents went to visit my grandmother in a neighboring town, leaving me home alone for 2 days. I didn't think it would be anything special. I was an ordinary boy, loved watching TV, playing on the computer, and devouring all the horror stories my friends gave me at school. Back then, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal. I thought those things only happened in movies. But that day, in that moment, everything changed. Our house stood at the end of the street, surrounded by a large, old garden that became especially eerie in winter. The trees, covered in snow, looked like skeletons, and the bushes with their black, lifeless branches seemed like shadows forever lurking in wait. The house was old, over 100 years old, but it was well maintained. The dark brick facade, the ancient windows, always stained with traces of rain. It was all part of my world. My parents always said our house was special, that it was full of history, and sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could hear old secrets whispering in the walls. I, however, took this as nostalgic nonsense. That evening started like any other. I stayed home, turned on the TV, and began watching some old horror movie while I ate a sandwich. But then I heard something. It was the faintest sound, like a door creaking in the hallway. For a moment, I froze. Nothing unusual, probably just the wind. The house was warm, and even the hallway, where drafts usually cut right through, felt still. I resumed watching the screen, but something in the air felt off. A few minutes later, while I was in the kitchen making myself a snack, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, like someone was walking up the stairs. My gaze automatically shifted toward the staircase, which led to the second floor. My room was at the very end of the hall, and I often left the door slightly ajar so I wouldn't feel so alone in the dark house. The staircase, as usual, appeared normal. Worn wooden steps, slightly creaking when you walked on them. But now, they seemed... something was wrong. The steps seemed more ominous, as if something hidden in them was waiting. I turned away, but the kitchen was silent. Everything seemed normal. I finished my snack and hurried toward the living room, but then, once again, I heard footsteps. They were quiet, barely audible at first, but with each second, they grew louder. I looked at the stairs, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw someone standing at the top. In the darkness, I froze, staring at the spot, and then, for a split second, I saw something move. A shadow. It was moving down the stairs. I decided it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But my gut told me I wasn't wrong. I stood still, not daring to take a step. My eyes were fixed on the stairs. The shadow was moving slower, then disappeared completely. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way to the living room, where a large bookshelf stood. I looked away from the stairs, but the feeling like something was watching me never left. It was as if the house itself was alive, staring back at me. Then, when I looked back at the stairs, something strange happened. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. The stairs started to warp, becoming larger and then shrinking, as if something invisible was jumping up and down them. Then I heard a voice. It was faint, like someone was trying to say something through a wall. At first, it was barely audible, though with each passing second, it grew louder. I pressed myself into the wall, my heart pounding. "Help me," the voice whispered. I stood frozen. I couldn't move. My heart was racing, and my breath was shallow. This voice, it wasn't mine. It wasn't my imagination. Word by word, thoughts raced through my head. What is this? Why am I hearing this? Why can't I leave? Decision came quickly. I had to find the source. I ran down the hallway and started up the stairs. Blood was pounding in my ears, the cold still clinging to my skin. I reached the second floor and looked around. Everything seemed normal. But then I noticed a door that was always locked. The door to that room, the one my parents rarely mentioned. The room they always kept shut. I took the key and opened the door. The room was dark, but I turned on the light. And that's when I saw it. A bookshelf, an old mirror, walls covered in dusty cobwebs. But what really struck me was what I found lying on the floor. An old diary, one I had no memory of ever seeing before. It had yellowed pages and a cracked leather cover. I picked it up and opened it. Inside, on the first pages, were old, cryptic notes, strange, convoluted lines that seemed alien, dangerous. I didn't have time to finish reading. In that moment, the lights flickered out, and I heard a clear, loud voice. "Are you here to help me?" I dropped the diary and let the key slip from my hand. I ran down the stairs and out of the house, not daring to look back. The next day, my parents returned home, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But I knew something was wrong. The shadows, the whispers, the hidden rooms. It wasn't a coincidence. The house was empty, but its walls remembered, and they were waiting.
When I was 10 years old, I stayed home alone for the first time. My parents had gone on a business trip, and I was completely alone in our old house at the edge of town, where the wind always howled through the pipes, and the trees outside scratched at the windows with their branches. The house was large and, to be honest, a little scary, especially when it got dark. But I was old enough not to be afraid. At least, that's what I thought. That day was like any other. I turned off the TV, ate, and went to my room. The house was quiet, as old houses tend to be when the wind isn't howling through the hallways or making strange noises. I sat down at my computer, browsing through kids' websites and playing games I used to love. Time passed, and soon it started to get dark outside. I don't know why, but I had this feeling of unease that night. Everything felt too quiet, and the atmosphere in the house seemed to thicken. But I decided it was just my imagination and went on with my day. I picked up a book, an old one, with a worn-out cover that I had found in the basement. The first noises came when night had already fallen. It was a faint rustling sound, like someone walking down the hallway. I thought it was just a neighbor's cat running across our yard. But as the minutes passed, the sounds became clearer and louder. Footsteps, not from any animal, started to echo from different parts of the house. I put the book down and listened. My pulse began to race, and I could hear the sound of my heart beating in my ears. I got up to check what was happening. When I opened my door, the hallway was dark. Everything seemed normal, no signs of anyone moving. But when I looked toward the stairs, I noticed that the upper part of the house had been plunged into complete darkness, as if something were blocking the light. My heart began to beat faster, and I took a step forward. And then it happened. A creaking sound froze me in place. I glanced toward the kitchen. The door was ajar. At first, I thought it was just the wind making the door creak. But when I peeked into the dark kitchen, I saw something moving in the corner. A shadow. Strange, unnatural, like something massive was shifting in the corner, not fully distinguishable in the darkness. With every movement, the shadow became more solid. I felt a coldness fill my chest. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from a draft. It was the icy chill of fear that gripped my shoulders and neck. The shadow began to move toward me. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to me. When I looked back at the kitchen, the figure was closer now. I finally managed to take a step back, but suddenly the entire house seemed to sway. The walls began to vibrate as if something huge was approaching. I ran down the hallway toward the stairs, but when I turned to climb them, the steps started to disappear. I couldn't understand what was happening. The house was changing. The walls were warping, the floors twisting, the steps were fading, like they were being swallowed by an abyss. I leaped onto the last few steps, and suddenly, a door appeared in front of me, a door I had never noticed before. It was barely visible, hidden in the wall, but I felt that I had to go through it. I pushed the door open, and it creaked horribly. Inside was darker than anywhere else in the house. The footsteps grew louder, and I felt as though something was watching me. I could sense its gaze, this thing that had come for me. It knew I was here. It was watching me. I didn't understand what it was, but all I could think was, hide. But how could I hide when the walls were crumbling and the house was becoming more abstract and dangerous? At that moment, I heard a familiar voice, my mother's voice. It came from the kitchen. "Do you hear something, son?" I screamed and turned around in a panic, but as soon as I made a move, I found myself back in my room, in the same position I had been hours before. Everything had returned to normal. The house was silent again. I sat in the dark, still not understanding what had just happened. One question kept swirling in my mind. What was that? I got up from the chair and went to the window. Outside, everything was calm, and then I realized it had all been a dream. I returned to bed and closed my eyes again, trying to forget the nightmare. But nothing about it had left me, as if it had been real. When I finally fell asleep, I thought I saw someone standing in the darkness. I woke up with cold sweat on my forehead, breathing heavily. Everything was the same as before. Everything was fine, but inside me, there remained that same strange, unexplainable fear. I still don't understand what was real and what wasn't, but I know for sure that the house and what happened in it would never be as simple for me again. Maybe it was just a dream, but when I closed my eyes again, I thought I could feel someone watching.
When I was a kid, I often stayed home alone. My parents worked late, and my grandmother, whom I visited often, lived on the other side of town. But this particular night stuck with me for the rest of my life. That night, when I was alone, I learned that fear could be much more real than I had ever imagined. Our house was old, full of corners and dark nooks. My room was on the second floor, right across from the balcony, which was always cold and windy. That night, it was especially quiet, no sound, not even the stars piercing through the thick clouds, with only the dim light from a street lamp barely illuminating the porch. I was sitting in my room watching TV and eating popcorn. Honestly, I wasn't that bored. I was old enough not to be afraid of the dark. But that night was different. It all started with a strange noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the wind, moving through the old windows. The house was old, and things often creaked or shifted. I didn't pay much attention. However, the noise happened again, louder and clearer this time. I stood up, left the popcorn on the table, and headed to my room door. It was dark, and I squinted, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. My hand reached for the light switch, but then I stopped. Something felt off. The noise was still coming from the kitchen, but now it was unmistakable footsteps. Someone was walking inside my house. Not outside, not in the yard inside. I froze, trying to make sense of it. Strange, but I hadn't heard anyone come through the door. So why were there footsteps? Was it just the old house creaking again? I turned away and looked out the window. It was closed, and I couldn't see anything. But that nagging feeling like someone was watching me wouldn't go away. After a moment's hesitation, I decided I'd go check. Maybe someone had entered the house by accident. I opened my door quietly and stepped into the hallway. The first few steps were easy and unnoticed, but then I heard another sound, soft, almost inaudible, like the rustling of clothes dragging across the floor. It came from the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't explain it, but it made me feel uneasy. This wasn't the kind of noise I could just ignore. It was something alien. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the lights in the house were off, and I realized the kitchen light, which was always left on when my parents went out, was also out. I carefully approached the kitchen and peered out the window, hoping to see something familiar. And that's when I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the kitchen, hidden in the shadows. A man, tall, with dirty clothes, a sloppily buttoned jacket, and a dull, lifeless gaze. I froze, feeling something heavy settle in my chest. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. All I could do was stand there and watch him. He didn't notice me. He just stood there, staring into the dark corners of the kitchen as if waiting for something or someone. And then, as though he'd heard something, he turned and started walking toward the door. I quickly backed away, hiding behind the column that separated the kitchen from the dining area. The moment his shadow passed by, I realized I couldn't let him find me. I had to run. But where to? My eyes scanned the room, and I realized my only option was upstairs, to my room, where I could lock myself in. I moved quickly, as quietly as I could, toward the stairs. But then I heard his footsteps again. He was moving toward me. I managed to hide behind the stairs, but I stood there, holding my breath, as if his steps were as fast as lightning and his presence untraceable. He moved slowly toward me, as though he knew exactly where I was. I wasn't ready for what happened next. He went around the corner and started climbing the stairs, as if I wasn't important, as if he were simply following me. Fear gripped my stomach. I didn't know what to do. In my hands, I only had an empty juice bottle. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, as if it was about to burst. I crouched down, pressing myself against the cold wooden floor. The wall behind me felt too close, and I knew that every movement, every noise, could give me away. Then, the door to my room opened. He stood in the doorway. His face wasn't visible, but I felt his gaze pierce through me, as if he were scanning every movement. He didn't say a word, but his face reflected something terrifying. Still, I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but he was too close. He stepped forward, and I noticed that in his hand he held a long, pointed stick. In the next moment, I ran, darting past him and down the hallway, locking myself in the bathroom. I blocked the door with a chair, trying to make no sound. In that moment, I realized I was trapped. He was here, and he knew I was alone. And the scariest part wasn't that he'd come. It was that he knew who I was and where I was. That night, I survived, but I will never forget the man in the corner of the kitchen. He wasn't just a maniac. He was someone who knew how to make fear real. All I could do was pray and hope that he would leave.